The restaurant was the kind of place where people didn't look at prices, where silence was a commodity, and every table was an island. Victoria Hayes had a fork in her hand when she saw him, a man in a worn jacket sitting across from two small children, cutting a single entree into careful thirds. Something in her chest went still. She set the fork down, but it slipped, clattering against the rim of her plate. Every nearby head turned toward her. She didn't notice. She was already standing, already walking toward his table. No one in that room understood what was happening, not her business partner, not the maitre d', not the man himself. But buried beneath that moment was a secret 8 years in the making, and it was about to come loose. Victoria Hayes did not come to Arden's because she enjoyed it. She came because the corner booth on the east side of the room offered the clearest sightlines to the entrance, because the noise-dampening panels allowed for conversations that stayed private, and because her dining partners, the sort of men who wore watches that cost more than sedans, understood that an invitation to this table was a signal. It meant she was serious. It meant the deal was nearly done. She had built Vertex Technologies from a licensing agreement and $112,000 into a company valued at $4.3 billion. The press called her a visionary. Her board called her indispensable. Her competitors called her difficult, which was the word people reached for when they meant disciplined and refused to say so. She was 38 years old, and she wore her authority the way other women wore jewelry, not for show, but because it had become part of the structure of her body. Tonight's dinner was the closing stage of an acquisition that would give Vertex a foothold in the European software market. The man across the table, a Zurich-based executive named Gerald Fenn, had been talking for 20 minutes about synergies and integration timelines. Victoria had been listening with one portion of her attention while the rest of it arranged the room around her the way it always did. Cataloging exits, noting faces, measuring risk. She did not believe in luck. She did not believe in coincidence. She believed in the information contained in small observable details, and she had learned, over the course of her life, that most people revealed everything about themselves in the first 30 seconds of any encounter if you were willing to be still enough to watch. She had not always been this way. There was a version of Victoria Hayes who had believed in something softer and trust extended freely, in the generosity that comes from assuming the best of people before they've earned it. That version of herself had been taken apart, piece by piece, by one specific failure she had never fully examined. She kept it stored somewhere beneath the floor of her daily thinking, sealed over and walked on top of. She had become very good at not looking down. The restaurant hummed around her. Gerald Fenn reached for the breadbasket. Victoria's gaze drifted without intention toward the center of the room, where the lighting was warmer and the tablecloths were plain linen instead of pressed damask. That was where she saw them. Daniel Brooks had been saving for 6 weeks. He kept the money in a small envelope inside the kitchen drawer, tucked behind the rubber bands and the takeout menus and the birthday card his daughter Emma had made him last spring, the one where she had drawn a picture of the two of them holding hands under a sun with 8 rays. $17 a week, set aside without ceremony, added up to just enough. Emma was 8. She had her mother's serious eyes and her father's habit of tilting her head slightly to one side when she was working something out. She did this now as she read the menu, her lips moving almost imperceptibly, sounding out words she didn't know. She would not ask what they meant. She didn't like to seem uncertain. Noah was 5, and he had no such concern. He had already asked what beef bourguignon was, and whether soup counted as a drink, and whether the man by the window was famous, and whether they could have dessert twice. Daniel had answered each question with the same patient gravity he brought to everything involving his children. He held the laminated menu low enough for Noah to see, and used his finger to trace the items, explaining each one in a voice that was quiet enough not to carry but warm enough to fill the small space between them. His hands were rough. The knuckles of his right hand bore a faint scar from a pipe-fitting job 2 years ago that had gone sideways in an apartment building on the east side. He wore no watch. His jacket was clean, but it was old, and anyone who looked closely enough would have noticed that the stitching at the left shoulder had been repaired. Probably by himself. He ordered carefully. He asked Emma what she wanted first, writing nothing down but forgetting nothing. He ordered Noah's food without asking, because he already knew, and when the server raised an eyebrow at the modest selection, Daniel met his gaze without apology, and said simply that they'd also have water, still, and perhaps some bread if it wasn't any trouble. He spoke well. Better than the jacket suggested. Better than the job on his driver's license suggested. The one that said plumbing and electrical services. The sentences were constructed with a precision that didn't call attention to itself, the way very good craftsmanship rarely does. Noah asked about the chandelier above them, and Daniel told him how the crystals worked to scatter light, and for a moment the explanation carried in it the ghost of someone who had once known a great deal more about the physics of the world than a plumber was required to. Emma looked at her father in the way children sometimes do, with a particular unself-conscious love that has no language for itself. She reached across the table and tucked her hand briefly over his, then returned to her menu as if nothing had happened. Daniel sat back slightly and looked around the restaurant with the contained expression of a man who is absorbing a moment he knows he won't be able to afford again for a long time. He didn't look embarrassed. He didn't look resentful. He looked, simply, present. Victoria did not register any of this consciously at first. Her attention moved across the room in its usual way, measuring, assessing, moving on. But something snagged, some detail that didn't complete its transit through her mind and kept returning. It was the way he cut the food. He was dividing a portion of roasted chicken into pieces small enough for Noah's fork, and the movement of his hands was familiar. Not the action itself, which was ordinary enough. Something in the angle of his wrist. The way he stabilized the plate with the back of 2 fingers, rather than his palm. A very specific proprietary gesture, the kind a person performs 10,000 times before it becomes unconscious. She had seen it before. She was certain of it, and the certainty arrived before the memory did, leaving her stranded in a strange brief confusion, the knowledge without its source. Then the little boy said something, and Daniel laughed softly. And he replied in a voice she could not hear at this distance. But the shape of his mouth was enough. She had seen those words formed before. She had heard them. She could almost reach the memory. It was close, hovering somewhere just above the surface of her thinking, and then it slipped again. Victoria's hand moved without direction. The fork tilted at the rim of her plate and fell, striking the porcelain with a clear, sharp sound that passed through the murmur of the room like a stone through water. Several people looked. Gerald Fenn paused mid-sentence. The maitre d' glanced up from the host stand. Victoria was not looking at any of them. She was looking at the man in the worn jacket, and a feeling was moving through her chest that she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time, something close to recognition, and close to dread, and not entirely separate from grief. She stood up. She did not excuse herself. She did not pick up the fork. She was moving before the conscious part of her mind had completed the decision, crossing the warm center of the room toward that table with the plain linen cloth, and the 3 water glasses, and the small family arranged around them like something tender and breakable. Gerald Fenn said her name once. She did not hear it. The children saw her first. Emma's head came up, and her expression shifted into careful watchfulness. Noah observed the approaching woman with the uncomplicated curiosity of a 5-year-old who has not yet learned to read social tension. Daniel felt the change in his children before he saw the cause of it. He turned. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Victoria stood at the edge of the table, and whatever she had intended to say when she crossed the room had not survived the walk. She looked at him directly, the way she looked at everything, without flinching, without softness, but something in that look was fractured now by something she couldn't quite hold back. She sat down, not in a chair she had been offered. She simply pulled the empty seat from the corner of the table and sat, placing herself into their family the way someone might step into a room that they have dreamed about and are not sure is real. Emma looked at her father. Noah looked at the woman. Daniel looked at Victoria with an expression that was not afraid, and was not welcoming, and was not entirely surprised. And that last part was the thing that reached her deepest. "What's your name?" Victoria asked. Her voice was steady. She had made it that way deliberately. The man held her gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he said, "Daniel Brooks." The name landed in the space between them and sat there. Every person in the surrounding radius of the room was watching. The table 3 feet away had stopped pretending to read their menus. A server had paused with a tray balanced at his shoulder, uncertain whether this was a scene requiring intervention. Gerald Fenn had half risen from his chair across the room, one hand on the table. Victoria did not acknowledge any of them. She was looking at Daniel Brooks, and she was doing the thing she did best, reading the details. The steadiness of his hands on the table, the way he had positioned himself slightly forward, a subtle physical barrier between her and his children. The absence of fear in his face, which she recognized not as courage exactly but as the particular stillness of a man who has already survived something very hard and no longer expects the world to be gentle. "These your kids?" she asked. "Yes," he said. Emma's eyes moved between them. Noah had already returned to arranging his bread into a small tower. The server made his move. He approached from the left. Professional apology already organized on his face, a quiet word about disruption. A gentle suggestion that perhaps the lady would be more comfortable at her own table. He began, "Excuse me, I'm afraid." Victoria turned her head a quarter turn and looked at him. Just looked. The server stopped speaking. "Give us some privacy," she said. "Not a request." He retreated. She turned back to Daniel. For a moment, the noise of the restaurant seemed to recede, the clatter of silver and the murmur of conversation pulling back like a tide. Emma had set her fork down. Daniel had not moved. "You went somewhere," Victoria said, and her voice had dropped, and it was no longer addressed to the room. 8 years ago, you were there, and then you weren't. I need to know why." Something shifted in Daniel's face. Not much. The way a door moves when there's wind behind it, just enough to register that something is pressing from the other side. "You have the wrong person," he said. "I don't think I do." His jaw tightened. Emma was watching him now with that particular attention children give to adults when they sense something beneath the surface of what is being said. Daniel's hand moved to cover hers on the table, a quiet instinct. "My kids are here," he said. It was not an argument. It was a boundary, placed with precision. Victoria held his gaze for another beat. Then something in her posture changed, not softening exactly, but recalibrating. She looked at Emma, who looked back at her with those serious eyes that gave nothing away. She looked at Noah, who had finished his bread tower and was now examining his knife with the deep scientific interest of the very young. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Victoria said, still quiet. "Then what are you here for?" Daniel asked. She didn't answer right away, because the honest answer, she was beginning to understand, was one she hadn't expected to discover when she woke up this morning. She was here because for the first time in 8 years, the sealed-over place in the floor of her thinking had cracked open, and something underneath it was asking to be looked at. Gerald Fenn had returned to his table. He would send her an email in the morning that was professional and entirely devoid of curiosity, the way emails from men like Gerald Fenn always were. The deal would close on schedule. The acquisition would proceed. None of that had changed. But something else had, in the crossing of a room. And Victoria had enough self-knowledge to understand that she was not someone who crossed rooms without reason, and that the reason she had not yet articulated was going to take some time to arrive at clearly. Victoria was not someone who proceeded from intuition. She had built her career on evidence, on documentation, on the rigorous refusal to act before the data justified action. But the instinct that had crossed the room ahead of her was not coming from the same place as her business decisions, and she knew it, and she was sitting with that knowledge in a way that was unfamiliar and not entirely comfortable. She leaned forward slightly. "How long have you been in New York?" "Long enough," Daniel said. "What do you do?" "Plumbing. Electrical. Some renovation work." She took that in without visible reaction. "You went to MIT," she said. The air between them changed. Daniel's expression did not confirm it, and did not deny it. But the stillness that settled over him was its own kind of answer. Emma looked at her father. He didn't look at her. "Dad," Emma said, small and careful. "It's okay," Daniel told her, and his voice was easy, certain, and entirely controlled. He was protecting. Victoria sat back. She was assembling something, the gesture with the fork, the way he spoke, the construction of his sentences, the instinctive precision of his movements, details that did not belong to a plumber. Though she understood there was nothing wrong with being a plumber, they belonged to someone who had once occupied a different kind of space, a space she had known. 8 years earlier, Victoria Hayes had been running a company that was 9 months away from collapse. Her board had suspected it. Her investors were beginning to ask questions she couldn't fully answer. And then a young engineer had walked into a meeting she almost hadn't attended, carrying a proposal that should have been presented by someone else's team, and had proceeded to describe, in 40 minutes, the exact structural solution that would save her company's foundational product. His name had been listed on the proposal as a secondary contributor. She remembered thinking that the hierarchy didn't match the quality of the thinking. She had pulled him aside afterward and asked him direct questions, and he had given her direct answers, and by the end of the month he had been working for her not under contract but in that informal, essential way of people who carry things other people need. She had not thought about him often, after. Or she had trained herself not to. There is a particular discipline required to leave certain memories undisturbed, and Victoria had mastered it the way she had mastered most things, through repetition and through the quiet brutality of refocusing her attention every time it wandered toward something she couldn't afford to examine. For 14 months, he had been the invisible architecture beneath everything Vertex built. He had not wanted credit. He had wanted the work, and then he was gone. And the reason given, that internal audit had flagged a serious discrepancy, that proprietary code had been transferred outside the company, had arrived so precisely packaged that Victoria had accepted it without pulling at the edges. The company was fragile. The scandal needed to be contained. The man was gone, and she had let him go, and she had not let herself think about it since. She was thinking about it now. "Walk me through 2016, she said. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. The restaurant moved around them. Noah had grown bored with his knife and was looking at Victoria with the direct, unself-conscious curiosity that belongs only to people who haven't learned to hide their interest yet. His eyes were large and unhurried. "It was my fault," Daniel said at last. "I should have seen it coming. That's not what I asked." He looked at her with something that was neither anger nor resentment. It was closer to weariness, the kind that comes from having carried a story in silence long enough that telling it feels like more weight rather than less. "The kids," he said again. "I understand." Victoria nodded toward Emma. "Can she order dessert while we talk?" Emma's serious eyes went wide for just a moment. Then she composed herself and looked at her father. Daniel studied Victoria's face. Whatever he found there or didn't find produced a small, reluctant exhale. He finally told her, "Not all of it at once." He moved through it in the careful way of someone who has rehearsed the story only in his own mind and is rendering it in speech for the first time. In 2016, he had discovered that code he had authored was being routed through a secondary internal server not by him. Someone had been using his credentials. He had flagged it internally. Within 4 days, the audit had named him as the source of the breach. By the end of the week, he had been escorted from the building. He had retained a lawyer. The lawyer had found the external server access logs obscured in a way that was too clean to be accidental. But the company's legal team was faster and better resourced, and the case collapsed before it reached a second filing. He had no money left to continue. He had a daughter who was 8 months old. He had walked away. Victoria listened to all of this without interruption. The noise of the restaurant had become entirely irrelevant. She was in the kind of stillness that arrived before a very significant decision. "Why didn't you come back?" she asked. "When the company stabilized?" "When there was. Who was I going to appeal to?" he said. "You were the company." The sentence landed in the exact place he intended it to. She felt it. "You believed it," he said. Not accusing, just placing the fact on the table between them, as he had placed the bill every Sunday night for 6 weeks, quietly and without drama. Victoria did not deny it. She couldn't. She had believed it because it had arrived in a form designed to be believed, and because she had been afraid of what disruption would cost, and because the man was gone before she had properly considered what it meant that he had left without a fight. Emma was eating a small chocolate tart with focused, serious attention. Noah had fallen asleep against his father's arm, and Daniel had adjusted without appearing to notice, the way parents do, seamlessly, instinctively, as though the child's weight against him was simply part of his own body. Victoria made a phone call. She did not explain it to Daniel. She stepped away from the table to make it 3 minutes, returning without expression, and then she sat again and looked at her hands on the plain linen tablecloth. "I need to ask you something," she said, "and I need an honest answer." Daniel waited. "Did you know it was Marcus?" she asked. And this was the second fracture of the evening, because the slight change in Daniel's face told her that yes, he had suspected, that the name she had arrived at through 40 minutes of telephone conversation and 3 years of buried instinct was the same name he had been sitting with for 8 years in a worn jacket in an apartment he could barely afford. Marcus Webb had been with Vertex for 11 years. He had joined 6 months after Daniel left. He had built his position carefully, methodically, on the foundations of a product whose actual architecture he had not authored. He was currently Senior Director of Systems Integration, and he had been, for 3 years running, the person most likely to be named Chief Technology Officer at the next board cycle. Victoria's legal team found the first clean evidence within 72 hours. It was the kind of evidence that had been preserved not through luck, but through the specific carefulness of someone who, even at his lowest, had kept a copy of everything. Because Daniel Brooks was the kind of man who documented his work. Because he had built things that were meant to last. She called him on the third day. He didn't answer. She left a message that was 5 sentences long and very direct. He called back 2 hours later. She told him what the investigation had confirmed. She told him what Marcus had done: the credential theft, the server routing, the manufactured audit trail designed to point at the person least positioned to survive the accusation. She told him the company would be making a full public correction. There was silence on the line for a long moment. "What do you want from me?" Daniel asked. "I want you to come back," she said. "No." The answer arrived before she had finished the word want. There was no anger in it. There was no hesitation. It was simply the answer. Placed in the air between them, with the same quiet precision he brought to everything. Victoria had expected it. She had prepared for it. She had not prepared for how it felt to hear it. "The company owes you more than an apology," she said. "There's a position, Victoria." He used her name for the first time. It stopped her. "I don't want the position. I don't want to walk back into that building. I built something there and someone took it, and I lost 8 years proving something that should never have needed proving. I'm not angry. I'm done." She stood in the lobby of her office building with a phone pressed to her ear and the evening traffic moving past the glass doors. And she allowed herself, for the first time in a long time, to not have an argument ready. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he repeated. "I hear you." She called him again 4 days later. This time it was not about the company. She asked if she could take the kids to a museum that Emma had mentioned. She had heard it in passing, at the restaurant, the way Emma had quietly told Noah about the dinosaur exhibit she'd been reading about. Victoria had caught it and had held it without acknowledging it, and now she was choosing to acknowledge it. Daniel said he would think about it. He called back that evening and said yes. He said he would be there. She met them on a Saturday morning outside the Natural History Museum. And Noah was wearing a jacket with a hood shaped like a shark, and Emma was carrying a small notebook for writing down facts, and Daniel was holding 2 coffees, one of which he held out to her without comment. She took it. They walked through the exhibits for 3 hours. Noah ran ahead and had to be collected twice. Emma found 6 factual errors in the exhibit labels and wrote them all down in her notebook. Daniel walked beside Victoria, and they talked. Not about the company, not about Marcus, not about the 8 years of silence between them. They talked about the light in the Hall of Ocean Life, and about the way the blue whale suspended from the ceiling seemed to move if you stood still long enough. They talked about Noah's theory, arrived at independently and with great confidence, that dinosaurs were simply birds that had decided to become enormous. There was a moment, in the long, dim corridor of the fossil gallery, when Emma had run ahead to join her brother, and Victoria and Daniel were briefly alone in the low blue light between the display cases, and neither of them spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was simply there, carrying everything that hadn't been said, and for once Victoria did not feel the need to fill it. Her hand and his were perhaps 6 inches apart as they walked. Neither of them closed the distance, but neither of them moved further away. Marcus Webb resigned before the board could convene. The formal finding of the internal investigation was delivered to the press the following Monday. It was thorough, and it was specific, and it named names. Victoria stood at the press conference and spoke for 8 minutes in a voice that was level and exacting, and she said the words she had spent 30 years avoiding: that she had been wrong, and that the company had caused harm, and that the harm had consequences which could not be fully repaired, but could be acknowledged, and would be. She did not call Daniel that afternoon. She waited until the following morning, and when she called, she asked him to meet her. They met at a coffee shop 3 blocks from his apartment. He arrived exactly on time, because Daniel Brooks arrived exactly on time for everything. He sat across from her at a small table by the window, and the morning light came through at an angle and caught the faint gray that had begun to work its way into his hair at the temples. She told him she was not going to offer him the director position again. He nodded, unsurprised. She told him that the company had established a fund for independent technology development, small grants, extended over 3 years. for engineers working outside traditional corporate structures. She told him she had asked her board to authorize the first grant, and she told him the amount, and she said his name was on the proposal. He looked at her for a long moment. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "This isn't about making it even. I know that too." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and looked out the window at the street. A delivery truck was blocking traffic. Someone on a bicycle navigated around it with the efficient annoyance of someone who had done this 1,000 times. "Emma's birthday is next weekend," he said finally. Victoria looked at him. "She wants to go to that French place on Lexington," he said. "The one with the little cakes in the window. She's been looking at the photos for a month." He paused. "I thought maybe you'd want to come." The city moved past the window. A woman with a stroller negotiated the curb. The delivery truck finally found a gap in traffic and pulled away. Victoria looked at Daniel across the small table, and something in her face moved, not dramatically, not in the way that made scenes, but in the way that things move when they have been held very still for a very long time and are finally being allowed to settle. "I'd like that," she said. She didn't say anything else. Neither did he. The coffee was getting cold. A child at the neighboring table was explaining something urgent to her mother in the half-intelligible rush of a person for whom all things are equally and immediately important. The mother leaned in and listened. Across the table from Victoria, Daniel was looking at the window, and his profile in the morning light was the profile of someone who had decided, after a long time, to stop bracing for impact. Outside, the street was full of ordinary motion people walking toward things that mattered to them, carrying the weight of their particular lives, with the particular grace or struggle each of them had developed over time. It was not romantic. It was not resolved. It was simply the world, continuing, and the two of them sitting inside it with their coffee cups, and the careful new distance between them that was, for the first time, something they had both chosen. There would be other conversations. There would be mornings that were harder to navigate than this one, and questions that didn't have clean answers, and the long, slow work of trusting something that had been broken and repaired and might yet break again. None of that was simple. None of it was guaranteed. But the birthday dinner on Lexington was next Saturday, and Emma had already decided she wanted the cake with the lavender icing. And Noah would undoubtedly ask at least one question that nobody could answer, and Daniel would answer it anyway with patient and careful seriousness. And Victoria would sit across from them and think, not for the first time, and not for the last, that there are things in this world worth more than being certain you are right. That the willingness to sit down at someone else's table, uninvited, was maybe the most honest thing she had ever done.